Changing the aperture, changing the f-stop is one way to control your exposure, to control the brightness of the image. But it's not the only way. There are 3 ways, technically there are 4 ways that you can control your exposure. So just for the moment, let's put the aperture aside and let's talk about the next one, which is shutter speed. Now again, I'm going to go back and use this film camera for my demonstration because it's a lot easier to see with this old guy than it is with the digital. All right, so I'm going to open the camera up. Now again, back in the day, your film would go back in here. And I don't know if you can tell, obviously, let me show the close-up camera there. You cannot see through this, right? The lens attaches here, which means the light should go through. Now, if you look in the front, you can see a mirror there, and that mirror actually goes up into the viewfinder. That's how you can see when you put your eye to the back of the camera. But if you look at the back, you can tell there's no way for light to get in here. Well, here, it's a rectangular area. Let's see if I can do this upside down. This is called the shutter. And what will happen when I push the shutter release, when I take a picture, is that shutter will open. And it will stay open. In this case, it'll stay open as long as I hold the button down, just for demonstration. Are you ready? Here we go. Look, and you can see through it. There's my fingers behind it. Yay! Okay, and then when I let go, it's going to close. And then, of course, being a film camera, I have to recock it. So what would normally happen is I would set that shutter to be open for a certain amount of time. I would set the shutter speed at a certain fraction of a second. So let me start by setting it at something kind of slow. I want to set it for 1 second. So when I push the button, the shutter should stay open for 1 second and then close. Hey, look at that. You saw it happen. I'm going to put a white piece of cardboard down here just so it'll show up a little bit better. I hope it'll show up a little bit better. I'm throwing shadows on it is the problem. Here we go again, 1 second. Okay. And I've got a knob up here that allows me to change that speed. So I'm going to go down to a 1/2 second. Okay. Let's go a bit faster. Let's go down to, say, a 1/15 of a second. And the shutter speed works just by multiplying or dividing by 2. So if I start at 1 second, then the next step down I cut it in half, 1/2 second. Cut it in half again, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, a 1/16 of a second. Uh-oh, wait a minute. Let's round that off. Let's call it a 15th because the math is easier. A 30th of a second, a 60th of a second, a 1/25th of a second. Again, I rounded a little bit because it'll make 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second, 1/1000th of a second easier. We're talking about fractions of a second here. Now, 1/60th of a second is about as slow as most people can go if you're hand holding a camera. And that's fast enough that it's barely showing up on the video. Just kind of a flicker, yeah? Some people with very steady hands might be able to hand hold a 1/30th of a second. But if you're going to go any slower than a 1/30th of a second, the camera really needs to be on a tripod. Now, our Nikon cameras can go all the way up to 1/4000th of a second, which is pretty quick. It's very, very fast. It's fast enough to freeze an athlete, right? So if a basketball player was running past you and you grabbed that shot at 1/4000th of a second, he would be perfectly crisp, perfectly still. If you used a slower shutter speed, you'd actually see him moving a little bit. We call that motion blur. And the Nikon cameras, our new Nikon cameras, if I remember correctly, will go as long as 30 seconds. So if you were doing something with extreme motion blur, so between 1/4000th of a second, which is mind-numbingly fast, and 30 seconds, which is kind of slow, you can hit most anything in there. And again, every time it goes in halves. It's multiplying or dividing by 2, except they round the numbers off every once in a while. Now, again, if you think about this, I'm going to change this down to, let's go to a 1/15th of a second. Now, this 1/15 of a second works in conjunction with this. How big is the hole, right? So if I have a hole that's that size, what is that size? That happens to be f5.6. And I'm shooting at 1/15 of a second. And it works. It's a perfectly exposed image. But now if I change one of these, I have to change the other, right? If I just take my shutter speed and make it faster, I'm going to go from a 15th to a 30th. I've cut it in half once. I'm going to go from a 30th to a 60th. I've cut it in half again. That's every time I cut it in half or open it by 2, it's called 1 stop. So I have closed this down by 2 stops. It's 4 times as fast as it was. So now that picture is going to be 2 stops underexposed. It's going to be 2 stops too dark. So because I made that change and this shutter is now faster than it was, the only way for me to have a good picture, a properly exposed picture, is to take this iris and to let more light through it. Because I closed down 2 stops, because the shutter is 2 stops faster than it was, I'm going to have to open this from 5.6 to 4, then from 4 to 2.8. I'm going to have to open it by 2 stops. So now I'm letting 2 stops more light come in, but my shutter speed was 2 stops faster, and it evens out, right? I lost 2 stops of brightness to the shutter speed, but I gained 2 stops of brightness by opening the iris. You could think about it like if you had a coffee cup and you had different size things that you could pour from, right? If I have 1 second to fill this coffee cup, I'm going to need to pour a lot of coffee very fast. I'm going to need to have something that has a very large opening. But if I want to take 10 seconds to fill this same coffee cup, I'm going to have something smaller. That spout's going to have to let the coffee come through less fast, right? It's the same sort of thing. As the hole in the aperture gets bigger, the shutter speed gets faster to compensate for the fact that there's more light. Or think about it getting sunburned. If I walk outside with SPF 30 on, I can stay outside for a couple of hours. If I walk outside with SPF 10 on, I can only stay outside for, 15 minutes. If I walk outside with no SPF on, I can only stay outside for 5 minutes before I sunburn, right? There's a relationship between these two things. How much light is coming through the lens, how long the shutter is open. Okay, that gives us 2 things to play with. I told you there were 3, technically there are 4, so let's go ahead and talk about the next one.